discussion and areas very close to her heart and head. So, Catherine, sorry, and thank you for everything that you've put into making today happen. And we still value your presence, even if it's more background. So this is a really, really important discussion, central to the work of the Trust and to everybody here. And really the purpose of today, it says we're having a series of roundtables, and what we're trying to do is bring together our community, scholars, alumni, friends, people with an interest in areas. So particularly today, it's around investigative journalism, media freedom. And what we want to do is to build connections so that going forward, we can support one another and engage more intentionally, because we've got this incredible rich resource within as the Trust, the network of the Trust. And we really want to try to find ways to strengthen that. So yes, welcome. It's quite a small group, so it'll be a lovely, more intimate opportunity to engage with some very, very sharp minds. And yeah, we're going forward to connect and just to increase our respective impacts. So just very briefly, because I don't think Prof. Berger needs much introduction, but we are very honored to have you with us today. You know, we know you as a very well-respected academic who headed up the School of Journalism and Media Development at Rhodes University, or university formerly known as Rhodes, and now the Director for the Freedom of Expression and Media Development at UNESCO. And Prof. Berger is really, you know, the keystone in overseeing UNESCO's global work on press freedom and the safety of journalists and internet freedom, media pluralism, online, offline media development, amongst other things. So a warm welcome and our deep thanks, Prof. Berger, for your time and your sharing your experience and wisdom with us today. Just in terms of what to expect today, the session's structured as follows. If you'd just like to introduce yourselves briefly in the chat. Luckily, I think we've all had a chance just to say who we are, and there is more information on participants in that sheet that Catherine circulated. But do feel free, if you haven't already, just to type in your name, what you've studied, or where you are geographically. You can just choose from these questions, and your current role, if you're working, or any specific research or interest areas. Then our PhD scholar Clayton Moyle is going to be in conversation with Professor Berger for about 25 minutes, and there's some wonderful key questions that have already been circulated, but Nia will put them up as we go along. Clayton, if you could just prompt Nia when you're ready for those. And then after the conversation and the consideration of those questions, we'll open the floor for some further discussion. So if you have any questions or thoughts or observations as we go along, just make sure you note them in the chat so we don't miss anything out, because sometimes, you know, you think as people are talking. And then after the discussion, we'll have some time to just think about how we want to take this forward, you know, post this event. Yeah, so that's more or less structure. And then just in terms of, we've got a couple of guidelines that we find helpful in just helping us to have a productive time together. Nia, if you'll just put up that slide. Oh, it is up. Okay, so just if we can be fully attentive, it's really tempting when in these sessions to have lots of other windows open. But if you could just closing the other windows that you have open, and you know, wherever you are, we embrace that. If you've got kids around or you're in the garden or whatever, that's absolutely fine. We also just want to make sure that everyone gets to be heard and we can balance diverse perspectives. So it's just a matter of making space for other voices. If you can, if your bandwidth allows, please do use your video as much as possible, because then you get a real sense of engagement, and it's easier to connect with people if we can see one another. We don't have a lot of time, although it may seem like it, but we do want to respect, you know, the start and finish time of that, so we won't run over. And it's an hour and a half, so if you need a break, absolutely fine. Just take a break as you need it. We haven't scheduled any breaks in. Just if you could just type in the chat that you stepping out and you coming back in. So thank you for bearing with me with that. And now I'd like to hand over to Clayton Moyle just to take us forward through the discussion. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Gillian, for that. So if you check our information flyer that was sent by Catherine for this roundtable discussion, it says, let's bring our histories and narratives into the space. And that's quite great. And a quick one from me. We were introduced to the work of Professor Guy Berger quite early in our undergraduate studies here in Zimbabwe. And his article titled Theorizing the Media Democracy Relationship in Southern Africa was a tad bit heavy for us as undergraduate students at the time. But it introduced us to media, democracy, and society. And most importantly, we began thinking of the societal complexities that shape the media in the global south. Prof. Guy Berger is a leader in our field of journalism and media studies, and it is great to have you, Prof, with us here. We are humbled to host you. Now, our starting point is the state of the media and economy. We just want to talk about that. The newsrooms across the world have been facing financial challenges, and COVID isn't making things better. And in Southern Africa, some of our economies are weaker, probably too fragile. We just want to understand the state of investigative journalism in Southern Africa. Do we have a crisis?
Okay, let me unmute and greetings, everybody. It is so good to see you all and old friends as well. And if I can just make a few quick remarks before I answer the specific question. First, it's very moving that this man, CanonCollins, has this legacy, and really we should, as people who have grown up in Southern Africa, be so appreciative of our elders. And here you have an elder who made such a difference. So isn't it wonderful that what he stood for is continuing like this? So I work at UNESCO today, and that means I'm sort of trying to keep an eye on the entire world. I do have a long roots, as you say, in Southern Africa, and indeed in the apartheid years I was in exile in the UK, and that's when in 1986 I think I was a CanonCollins beneficiary, learning about design and layout and desktop publishing at the London College of Printing, and so that really helps consolidate the contribution I could make to communications. Now at UNESCO, we cover a lot of things, and investigative journalism is amongst those. There are two very nice manuals that UNESCO has produced called Storytelling and Investigative Journalism, because these are not, investigative journalism is not about a dry forensic investigation for a judicial process. It's about storytelling, and I think we can well keep that in mind, particularly when there's so much other competition in the content environment of entertainment, of disinformation, of opinions, and so on. And so I think this question of storytelling and investigative journalism is so important, because it's one of the unique things of journalism. It's not recycling just opinions or even original opinions. It certainly should not be this journalism of taking press releases and just putting them out to a wide audience. Investigation is the heart of actually adding new information, verified information, and of course, investigative journalism is that at scale with more depth. I'm not so much a direct expert in Southern Africa these days, because I've been here at UNESCO for 10 years. And some people there, like Beatrice Mwape from MBC, who's actually practicing this, all credit and respect to you. And, I think all of us should cheer on those who are actually doing the job. And I think people like Carolyn Lunga, who's studying at close hand, will have much more expertise than me. John Battersby, an old friend, he was an editor. He's practiced this much more than me. So my comments are a little bit distant, but I still hope that they can be of value. I wanted to say two things now in relation to your question about media viability and this issue of investigative journalism. So I hope people here may have heard of the Vintok Declaration. Actually, you can see in the background up there, that is the poster from the original Vintok conference 30 years ago, which was when Africa and African journalists gave the World Press Freedom Day, which was the Vintok Declaration for a free, pluralistic, independent press. And that led to such a difference for African journalists. Some things are very tough today, but I can tell you 30 years ago, it was much, much tougher. There was actually in many countries only one state broadcaster and maybe one state newspaper. So things have changed a lot, and that declaration had a lot of influence. So earlier this year on the World Press Freedom Day, which was a gift of African journalists to the world, and which the UN General Assembly then adopted as 3 May, there was the Vintok Plus 30 declaration this year. 30 years on, of course, things have changed. And that's focused on, besides the long-standing freedom, pluralism, independence, it added viability, transparency, and capacity, VTC. I'll just work backwards. Capacity is we have to really do more today to educate audiences about what is journalism, what is social media, what is opinion, what is aggression, what's free services, what, all those issues about that, what their rights are, what speech should be protected under international standards, what kinds of expression is not protected and even illegal. So anyway, there's all the capacity side. Transparency, we need to know today how these internet companies are mediating communications. What they elevate, what they demote, why we each get different feeds, on what basis they do it, how they make their money, advertising reaches us on what basis, how are we kind of very subconsciously exposed to a curation that we're not even aware of. So we wanted to have transparency, and particularly because in the way the internet's working, it's these internet companies, as we all know, amplifying a lot of hate, disinformation, division, tolerating the trolls, in fact, in some cases, even recommending people, pointing people to go to the trolls, and having real consequences, as you can see, of course, even in the USA. It's the instrumentalization of these algorithms with the blessing of the companies to really foment anti-democratic activity. So transparency we need. And then coming to viability, which is your key thing. Of course, everybody knows that viability now, it's such a big pressure. And I have to say in this regard, strongly viable media is not necessarily a recipe for good investigative journalism. Often strongly viable media is captured media, captured by government, captured by businessmen. I say men in the gender sense because they may be men, captured by various political forces. And they could be strong economically. That doesn't mean they do investigative journalism. So that's the one issue. In fact, people, if you're interested in this whole thing of media capture, earlier this year, UNESCO published quite an interesting 30-page, even 16-page report on media capture. So you could, but anyway, when we come to independent media, or when we come to people who working in state-owned media, but trying to do some journalism as opposed to propaganda, the economics are important, of course, because it depends how big is a newsroom, how many people can actually be spared on a story, and there's not a lot of money around. And yet, as I was arguing, one of the most unique value adds that really makes independent journalism distinctive in the world is this question of investigation. So, if newsrooms are cutting back, or if there are political limits and so on, in this multi-content universe, if newsrooms stop doing journalism and stop doing investigative journalism, really, they will just disappear into the mass of everything else. So actually, it makes sense then that newsrooms should still continue to try and do some journalism. It's much better to do a few stories better than to try and do everything, which anyway, a lot of other people are doing that. So what value add are you doing? And if you do investigative journalism, and all journalism should have some investigation, of course, so that's what I'm saying. But if you can do like deep investigative journalism, it is a way to help strengthen media, not just in terms of your value add, but because it attracts resourcing. Now, there's a debate which I think we'll have about donors and investigative journalism. But if you don't do it, you're not going to put yourself in the market for it. You need to have some kind of track record. And so I do think that's important. And the last thing I want to say on this question is that we've seen over the past few years, very, very interesting international investigative journalism corporations. Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, and now we've got, and there was one other P, I can't remember which one it was. And recently we've got this, it's called CumEx, C-U-M-E-X. And what is in common with all these investigative journalism, international collaborations, they show tax cheating, tax evasion, safe havens. And as a result of that journalism, the public fiscus is able to, in some cases, recoup funds, in other cases, stop this leaking of funds to Switzerland or the Virgin Isles. Now, the question is, if journalism is helping save public money, surely there should be some way to support that kind of journalism. Now, in the USA, they actually have an interesting modality, which is whistleblowing. If a whistleblower saves the US government money by exposing fraud, tax evasion, corruption, the whistleblower can get a reward, recently up to $1 million. Now, some people are worried about this because they say this system could lead to, journalists becoming bounty hunters. They're just chasing the money. Well, okay, that's maybe an issue. But if the overall effect is that there is investigative journalism, which is getting money back, not necessarily to the individual, but to the media house. I mean, it seems to me it's something to look at, especially when it's very hard to make money in other ways, to make money from advertising, to get money from taxpayers, from the government, which have that independent. But if you have a whistleblower fund that has an objective formula, you save so much, you get so much. Maybe that's something to look at, put on the policy agenda.
And this last point relates to what one of my colleagues, Caroline Lunga, has put forward as a key provocation here. She asks, are leaks part of investigative journalism in the present context?
Could you repeat it?
I'm saying this last part relates to a question that has been raised by a colleague, Caroline Lunga.
Right.
She asks, are leaks part of investigative journalism in the present context?
Yes. So let me check what I did read these questions, and I wanted to see what notes I made here about leaks. Okay, so I think that we see that these big investigations are the result of leaks. In Southern Africa, we can see they are also the result of leaks. Now, what's interesting here is that leaks and whistleblowing often go hand in hand. And so people may have heard the story that very recently, a person who worked for Facebook called Francis, what's her name? Cowgan. I just had a blank there. She was an employee at Facebook, and she leaked what they call the Facebook files. And the Wall Street Journal published 5 powerful stories showing just how problematic Facebook is in regard to the ecosystem of content. And now those same papers have been given to a consortium of 17 media. I think there might be like Daily Maverick involved in that. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I'm a Bungani. But anyway, so now these have gone further. So this whistleblower, she's being very celebrated for having the courage to come out and read these papers. What I want to just signal here is that she didn't just wake up one morning and decide she was going to leak these papers. What happened was that the first journalist, a guy called Ben Horowitz at the Wall Street Journal, he's reporting on Facebook. He went on LinkedIn. He said, okay, who in LinkedIn is working for Facebook? He sent them all messages. He said, hey guys, I'm Ben Horowitz. Got any news for me? And she checked him out. She said, no, well, let me maybe speak to this guy. And they met, and he cultivated this contact. He said, look, okay, I can't encourage you to break the law because it's illegal to leak company documents, but what's the public interest in this thing? And he talked her through it, and she developed trust with him. If he hadn't have done that, she might have still been there, sitting on these documents, feeling very unhappy about her job, but he unlocked it. Now, that I think just shows you the importance of when you have a whistleblower and when you have a journalist who can work together, build that confidence, then you've got a magic relationship. The last thing I just want to say on the leaks question is UNESCO was promoting a project in Southeastern Europe called Legal Leaks. Legal Leaks. And Legal Leaks was, you say to journalists, use freedom of information laws to get information that isn't necessarily put out there proactively, that wouldn't be something that necessarily the powers that be want to see out there, but under freedom of information it's there. And so you as a journalist, you do that. Maybe it's wrong to call it a leak, but really these laws, which many African governments now have, it's something to really think of using, because it's an instrument in the environment that can make more access to information. You might know, for example, there's a move in Africa pushed by the Ugandan African Freedom of Information Center, AFIC, to have open contracting, that all contracting should be put online. Well, I mean, that's a real mine for journalists to then go and check this and see what looks suspicious and what doesn't look suspicious, and to make those connections.
Prof, we've got a lot of questions for you. Perhaps to move on. Tuesday was the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. And recently we have seen that the COVID pandemic opened a floodgate of resources that were abused by politicians and some bureaucrats in government. And investigative journalists did a very good job, even focusing on Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. They did a good job of exposing these abuses of resources and the abuses of power. But this has come at a cost for some journalists. They've been targeted in a crackdown to silence them. And we just want to focus on the safety of journalists. Why does it continue to be a problem?
Yep, indeed, you're completely right. And this Tuesday, this International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, it's a fantastic day on the calendar, which I'm pleased to have been associated with the international community that got this agreed at the UN General Assembly. And actually, the day commemorates the murder in Mali of 2 French journalists. So there's an African connection, but of course the connection is much more, because we have journalists who are killed in Africa and no justice at all. And so part of this is looking at those kind of crimes, because it's a crime to kill people per se. I mean, that goes without saying. And 9 out of 10 of these crimes are not solved. And this is a day when you can really say, okay, enough. What's the problem? Is there not a dedicated task force in the police to be investigating this? Why not? Because of course, it's not just those individuals who are killed and their families and their colleagues who have no justice. It sends an intimidating message to the whole society. Now, you mentioned this question of imprisonment. So imprisonment, it's definitely a threat to safety of journalists. And generally in the international community, the standard is journalism is not a crime. In the sense you should not be jailed for journalism. And we see that. So journalists are being criminalized and actually put in prison. Now, the pattern that we actually see is quite interesting, and there's a new UNESCO report we released on Tuesday. It's called Threats That Silence. The report, Threats That Silence. And this report shows two things. One is that killings, impunity continues. Over 10 years hasn't moved, no improvement. But the number of killings is down a little bit. Still terrible, 400 in the past 5 years, 400 journalists. Okay, that's, just hard to get your head into, think of 400 individuals. Anyway, and it gives you the figures in Africa in this report. Thanks, Gillian, for posting the link in the chat. So the killing, but to 400 killed, it's different because the previous 5 years, it was almost 500. Okay, so killings are going down, but imprisonments are going up. So this is interesting. In other words, it seems that, well, it's a complicated story I won't go into now because it takes too much time. But imprisonments, now some of these imprisonments are done according to the law. And then the question is the law a just law? Does it meet international standards, or is it arbitrary? By arbitrary, it means it's disproportionate. So people often say that defamation, sure, journalists can sometimes, be ethically problematic and defame, and that shouldn't happen because people do have a right to dignity. But should it be a criminal offense as opposed to a civil offense? So where you have a criminal defamation law, generally in the international community, people say, no, this is not proportionate. It's too much. It's excessive, because it's not necessary to criminalize a journalist and put them in jail for defamation. You can have civil law and other kinds of things. So when these journalists are being jailed, we're seeing this increasing tendency. Now, it's a little bit difficult to get into the nuances of every single time. Is this an arbitrary law under which they're jailed, or are they being even arrested without even any legal basis? It's quite a difficult thing. But ultimately, what we have to do is we have to build a climate that journalists should be able to work in safety without fear of attack, without fear of arrest, so that they can do their journalism, and where they can do the best possible and not give any excuse to people to jump on them. Their journalism has to be rock solid, because if it's not rock solid, be sure that those who want to take action against you, even private, what they call SLAPs, strategic litigation lawsuits, these will be used against you, or the government will use it against you. So it's got to be rock solid. And now I just want to mention one last thing with regard to this impunity day, which is important, which is that there was a journalist in the country of Malta in the Mediterranean, which is in the European Union. Her name was Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was assassinated in a car bomb about 4 or 5 years ago. And she was investigating corruption in that country. And her case is still not resolved. But in response to that case, what happened was that journalists in a number of countries, they said, we are going to continue her legacy. And they did. With the message being to those who killed her, you can kill the journalist, but you don't kill the story. So don't waste your time killing the journalist. In fact, you'll make us more determined to follow the story. And they now also formed a project, which is even called Forbidden Stories. And Forbidden Stories was, in fact, the consortium who recently did a very big expose, investigative journalism, into what they call Pegasus papers, which is all the spyware from this Israeli company that's been used to spy on journalists and politicians. So just my answer to you on this impunity question, if a journalist is in danger of being arrested or worse, assassinated or pushed into exile, it really is important for a community of journalists to say, an action against one doesn't kill the story. The story continues. And that's a change in culture a bit, but it can be done. And I think the more we can do it, the more we can reduce incentive for those who want to jail journalists or worse. Back to you.
Yes. Speaking of threats that silence, there is a survey that was done by your organization. Not sure if it's part of this report, but the results show that 73% of online violence target women. And clearly, this is a way of silencing women journalists. How big a concern is this in your work, this gendered violence against women journalists?
Yes, this report, The Threats That Silence, does make reference to that research. That research actually we published under a different title called The Chilling, because it's a chilling story to hear about this abuse of women journalists, and it chills them. In other words, it makes them more worried about saying what they want to say and reporting what they should report, and chasing some of them out of the profession. The threats that they have been telling us they get are unbelievable. Threats, not just I'm going to rape you, but how I'm going to rape you. Threats to how I'm going to rape your children. It's just the kind of inhuman species who can do this to anybody. It beggars the mind. Now, I want to just make a slight clarification to the way you present your understanding of this. So this research, it's not that 73% of online abuse targets women or women journalists per se. I don't know. I mean, that you'd have to do a global survey of, how much abuse is there and how much is geared towards men, women, and so on. In this particular case, UNESCO did a study, and it's not a generalizable study, but there was an interview worldwide, I think about 70 countries, and more than 700 women journalists responded. Of those 700 women journalists, the 73% said they had experienced this online abuse. Now, it's not representative, so because I'm speaking to scholars here also, we must be careful, we mustn't generalize too much from this. Actually, it might be worse, maybe a bit less, but even amongst these 73% of those who responded, say if even supposing, I don't know, I'm guessing now, but even worldwide, say it's only 20% of women journalists have experienced online abuse. In the sample, it's a self-selected sample, so these were people who were concerned about. But even if it's 20%, and you're getting these terrible threats, that how I'm going to cut you into pieces and I'm going to torture you for 3 hours and so on. I mean, and less offensive, but still distressing stuff, saying what you need is a good lay because you're not attractive, and and coupled with other things, racism, homophobia, and religious bias and all this other stuff that really gets piled onto women journalists. It's still a mega problem. And now I come back to this question of impunity, because basically women journalists, they're expected to somehow survive this, deal with this themselves, report abuse on the platforms. And let me tell you about the case of Maria Ressa, who is a Philippines journalist who has just won the Nobel Prize with a Russian journalist. First time in 70 years, I think more than 70 years. Anyway, that a journalist won the Nobel Prize. Maria Ressa, she has been such a huge victim of online abuse in her country, Philippines. It's incredible. I won't even go into detail, but if you want to look into this, you can see there was an article published by UNESCO about her experience called an injury to one is an injury to all, Maria Ressa. And what this shows, very interestingly, is that she was getting more than 60 abuse per hour. Now, if you wanted to report abuse, she's got to sit there, at a computer. She can't do any work. She's got to report abuse, report abuse, report abuse. What she did was she did do that reporting, and the companies did nothing, particularly Facebook. So they did nothing in terms of actually proactively protecting her, screening, filtering, asking her how they can help. They did nothing about kicking these people off the platforms, except after a bit of time. Eventually, some people deplatformed. After a lot of, she's a partner of Facebook. She's running fact checking for Facebook. She publishes her medium Rappler on Facebook, but Facebook were really, way behind in terms of addressing this. So impunity. These people could attack Maria Ressa with huge impunity. Now, there's an investigative journalism aspect here that's interesting. Maria Ressa, then, she found that some of these people attacking on Facebook, they use their own accounts. Some were in the military, some were advisors to the government. And so she did investigative journalism, and she crowdsourced also, and she exposed this entire organized network. These were not just loose cannons, disturbed individuals who were anti-women. This was an organized effort, and very interesting how she did investigative journalism. So she was one of the first, long before any social media abuse started, coming to light in even Cambridge Analytica or the USA or the Brexit. She exposed this in the Philippines, how anti-democratic elements, anti-women elements, anti-journalism elements can get organized and exploit these algorithms with impunity. Back to you.
All right. Thank you, especially for highlighting Maria Ressa's story. It's an inspirational story, and her resilience is amazing in light of the attacks. And one of the most interesting things is that the Rappler started off as a Facebook page, which speaks to the importance of the work that is done by digital startups, particularly in investigative journalism. And I'm sure that may come up, but for now, I would like to open the floor to my colleagues here for an open session that they can come in now and ask the questions. Perhaps to do that, let me invite Caroline Dunga. She can start this open session.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Prof. Berger, for all these issues that you have touched on, which are very important. I just want to follow up on the issue of whistleblower protection and ask what then can be done to protect whistleblowers, because this is a problem that we have. And also seeing that a lot of these whistleblowers are also sharing information on social media platforms. What can be done solidly to protect them? We had, I think in South Africa, a case where a whistleblower within the health department was shot after dropping off her child from school. And that is very concerning. What can be done, in your opinion, in terms of a way forward?
Yeah, I'm aware of that case, and yeah, it's part of this criminality that does exist, and which we would be naive to ignore. I think that where journalism comes into it is obviously to tell those stories, to see what were the problems in protection of whistleblowers, where there were gaps, but also when journalists are working with whistleblowers to recognize the threats to them, and where necessary to give them anonymity, including even to the police. And that is part of journalism, to have confidential sources. Of course, in the case of anonymous whistleblowers, it's super important to be able to verify the information they bring, because some will bring you with a particular agenda, some will have half a story, and so on. So it's not enough just to take a whistleblower as being the authoritative kind of truth on this thing. As a journalist, you have to be skeptical of everything, of course, and double check it. But I think that what journalists can do is send a message to society. If you want to blow a whistle, if you come to us, we will keep your identity protected, but we will bring the issue to public attention. Now, in some countries, whistleblowers can still face repercussions if indeed the identity comes out. Still face repercussions from the employers, from government, and so on, or from criminals, and that is those are serious factors. But I would say a whistleblower who just goes solo, puts it on social media, they have no protection at all. A whistleblower who uses official whistleblower protection systems, which are set up in some countries, they're obviously going to have a bit more protection there, but sometimes, that also doesn't have the results. So I think we have to somehow incentivize whistleblowers that if they care enough, that media are amongst their best partners to really get the story out in a way that's going to, in the end, give them a degree of safety that maybe these other channels don't give them, and certainly a degree of potential impact.
Okay, thank you for that. If I can be allowed to ask another question. So this has to do with funding, and from conversations I've been having with journalists, we are seeing this rise in non-profit journalism, and they are the ones who are doing quite a lot of investigative journalism in the region. But some of them are citing challenges of editorial influence, and also the problem of where they are being required to write proposals and account for the money. Someone was saying like 2 times a year and so on, or more times. And that is a problem because it's taking a lot of their time and taking them away from doing the investigative work. What's your comment on non-profit funding? And do you think that could be the future of investigative journalism in Southern Africa?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult to give a definitive response here because, of course, nobody's going to give you money just because they think you're good people. They want to see a proposal and so on, and somebody's got to write that, and it does take time, and it's certainly not easy. And sometimes even you write a proposal, you get funds, and you can't. It's not possible to deliver the content anyway. And I suppose, I would say the most important thing here is that one has to be very careful that the tail, the funding, isn't wagging the dog. It must be that a newsroom decides that it will, put in a proposal because it's worth it from the point of view of the newsroom, even in terms of time and commitment. And that's a judgment call that they have to make. If it means that a journalist has got less time to go and do reporting, but you can pay the salary of that journalist, maybe that's a calculation that they make. They say, on balance, we'll do this. In terms of editorial influence, I think this is something that it also comes back, is this something that will be of public interest? It will be of interest to your audience. That's number one. You can't just let yourself be instrumentalized to go and do the dirty work of exposing one I don't know, political faction in interest of another political faction or some industrial interests or something like that. So, media have to really keep their integrity in this. But now, when you come to the question of captured media, captured in various ways, of course, this is going to be difficult because already you have these parameters set. There's red lines that you definitely are not going to be allowed, even without money, without even considering extra funding. You're not going to be allowed to go and investigate certain areas. Your bosses just won't let you do that. But can you do investigative journalism? I think you still can, and this is the trick of trying to find subjects which can still make a public difference. I'm thinking here, for example, and people could have a look in the Arab region. You have the ARIJ, Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism. As you can imagine, in many Arab countries, conditions are quite tight. Journalists cannot just go and do what they want to do in most cases, not only law, but also the owners. ARIJ has found a lot of very good stories to investigate. Things like child support, abuse of children in orphanages, stuff that really even the most authoritarian government has to accept that this is an abuse. This needs to be done. And so it's a matter of trying to find within your possibilities, what can you do as investigative journalism that could make a difference? And if you can get some resourcing for it, fantastic, because then you can do it on a bigger scale, and maybe you can even collaborate on it. There are a lot of topics as well that would go for cross-regional collaborations or cross-media house collaborations. Some of which might be more sensitive: drug smuggling, child trafficking. Those. So sometimes you have elements who control media who will not let you touch that, or they'll influence media not to let you touch it. But it's not exactly the same as saying, well, the president has a foreign bank account. Put it that way. These are areas that there's a spectrum of areas that can be investigated and can and should attract funding, even in state-owned media.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Prof. Now let's move to Tony Manyangazi.
Thank you, Clayton. So I think my question is going to be a follow-up from what Prof has just said. You mentioned that if you don't have enough funds, you can as well do stories that are like investigate on stories that includes child abuse. I've actually been doing stories around that when I was a journalist in Zim. And the biggest challenge with doing such types of stories is the issue of it affects you psychologically. So you go to a story, you investigate, and then you come across 9-year-old, 13-year-old little girls, selling sex for a living, and they share with you real stories of how they are abused. And after you talk to them, after you investigate whether or not it's happening, you go back to the office, you go back to the newsroom, and it affects you psychologically. So my question will be, what then should be done, especially to the journalists that are investigating these type of stories? It affects us also psychologically because we are human beings at the end of the day. So are there enough facilities or enough programs that are around to support journalists psychologically as well? So I think that would be my question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And I can only say much empathy to you for doing that work and finding those stories and being able to tell those stories, because the world needs to know those stories. And how you deal with it, it's not for me to say because I'm not in your shoes. It's clearly an extremely difficult thing, and we know that there are journalists who deal with stress in ways that are escapist. You seem to be, from what I can see, in good shape. You're not hungover from having to drink too much, cope with life. That's how they deal with their things. And it's a tragedy. And, you know, I would say that there's a few things here that come to mind. The one is collegiate support is so important. You know, you can't carry this emotional load only on yourself as a journalist. You have to share it with your colleagues and indeed with your news editor and share the load, even the reporting load. I mean, you know, somebody else has also got to kind of do that. At least colleagues who can say, you know, man, they really feel with you. You know, it just makes us more, somebody you can speak to also, then say how it's cutting you up, because the more you bottle it up, the more it just destroys you. That's the one thing. The second thing, of course, is to get professional support. And newsrooms where they have some capacity, they should really provide that. Pay it, or they need to recruit some pro bono psychological support, because these things are deep. You know, you cannot expect your friends and colleagues or your family to be therapists, but it's trauma. You know, there's a DART Center for Trauma. There are some online resources and so on, but you know, the newsroom, one has to lobby for a newsroom to take some responsibility here. You're doing it in their name, you know. They have to help. It seems so, and this, I don't know, but for every bad thing that a journalist reports, it needs to be asked, is there some solutions journalism angle to this? Because once you can start trying to report on some solutions, I think it can uplift your own emotional thing a bit. Those kids that you mentioned, is there a place where kids like that can go and they get some support? There must surely be some NGO that's trying to work with street kids to try to, you know, just get them to deal with those kinds of experiences. And if you can report on that, you know, is there a case of, I don't know, a police officer who's arresting, in this most likely men, who are buying sex from these underage girls? Can you tell that story? You know, I think the solutions thing is not only good for the society, but it's good for you as a journalist, because it just shows that actually, for all the disaster, the trauma, the emotional abuse that we have, there are human beings who are trying to do good. And if we can find what they're doing and see, even if they succeed in a tiny, small amount, maybe they can't get kids off the street, but at least they can make them feel a bit appreciated, valued, give them some coping skills for a day. I mean, it makes a difference. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a non-substantive answer, but I'd be very interested here if you think that solutions journalism, by which I don't mean, you know, kind of you know, propaganda journalism or sort of, you know, smiley journalism. I just mean, you know, coupling the problem with trying to point to some, at least tiny solutions. I mean, would that, did you do that? Is that the kind of thing that we can encourage journalists to do more of? Back to you, Tony.
Oh yeah, thank you so much, Prof. So we actually managed to then get some organizations that work with children, and even the government ended up intervening because the story went viral, and they intervened. The Minister of responsible for the portfolio that deals with children came to studio, and she spoke about it, and they also went to the area that we had identified. Then they rescued, I think, nearly 50 girls within a week. So it's sort of like you said, we felt better at the end of the day, like we have actually made a difference. Right. But it really is an issue. And I think solution, sort of coming up with a solution, or after you report on such a story and there's a solution at the end, I think it actually helps you even to cope emotionally. So I think that really should work as well. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. The floor is still open for colleagues. If anyone has a question, they can just come in and ask. Alan, you can come through.
Thanks, Clayton. I just wanted to tap into Guy's mind about something that I've been thinking about. I think there are two things. The first one is about the role of established global journalism structures in the whole discourse of investigative reporting. What do you think about the role that Reuters, institutions like the BBC, the CNN, the Washington Post, those that have over time built journalistic capital, what do you think they can do, especially to support investigative journalism in contexts where it is evidently in decline? Do you think maybe they can be allotted a special role based on the capital they have accumulated to be central in revitalizing this practice, which is very essential? That is actually the whole purpose of journalism. Investigative journalism is actually the whole purpose of what we call journalism. Then the second thing I wanted to check on is in Southern Africa. I'm actually referring to regions like Southern Africa, because my view is that I do not think politically this region is getting any better. I think authoritarianism is hardening. There is no much evident improvement in human rights, respect for human rights. So do you think we might as well need to redefine the trajectory of investigative journalism so that we focus on these broader issues of hardening authoritarianism, decline in investigative journalism, or we are better suited with the media that we have in its contemporary form? Those are the two questions that I have, at least for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Well, on the first question, I think we always have to try to position ourselves, and I think, as you say, those Western international news organizations, they have got certain capacities, certain experiences in investigative journalism. At the same time, if you position yourself as a Southern African, you're not the same. I mean, that's obvious, but you know, the kind of stories that they'll do, the kind of investigative journalism that they'll practice, the kind of resources they have, the legal environment they have, the newsrooms they have, it's different. And so I don't want to make a slogan, but in a way, I think investigative journalism has to be decolonized here also. And I think it's really important to take a critical view of these kind of partnerships, because sometimes what they look at is really excellent, but also what they don't look at is very important to know as well. You know, in the very first Panama Papers that came out, it wasn't necessarily those organizations, but it was Le Monde, The Guardian, and so on, not these global broadcasters, but you know, media, national media that's got international reach. In the nature of it, that very first Panama Papers was people asked, well, where does this come from? It's true information, but it was a selection of certain kinds of tax cheating. And in that set of papers, there wasn't much attention to UK tax cheating, and there wasn't attention to the US itself as a tax haven for tax cheaters. Now, this has come out in the latest papers that they had, the Pandora papers, which have fingered both the UK banks and places like South Dakota in the US as being tax havens and enabling money laundering. So you've got two different things there, two different investigations. They come with certain bodies of information. The first one puts the spotlight somewhere. The second one, I suppose you could say, compensates a little bit. Yeah, okay, it's not necessarily an agenda, a deliberate agenda, but It's where stuff comes from. You know, that there are certain, and I don't want to prescribe here, but I think that one has to ask, so the topics that they come with, these are key topics, but are they topics, and they are important topics. For example, say there's a topic about foreign multinationals dumping polluted materials in Africa. It's a very important story for Africans. Okay, for Africans, it could also be, well, why don't we see who the local partners are? You know, that's a different angle. I mean, who's making money locally out of taking these this toxic waste and just dumping it in the desert and so on. There are questions of intellectual property, for example. So I don't have to go into detail, but you know, there's much indigenous knowledge in Africa that just gets taken and commercialized, and no benefits come back to Africa at all. But you don't really see much investigative journalism coming from international agencies about this, because it's not top of mind for them. So this is what I'm saying, you know, one's got to, I'm not saying these are colonial organizations, but I do think it's Reuters, BBC, although BBC gives so much attention to the British royal family, you could say, well, you know, is that really so relevant? But then again, you have the other problem that the BBC gives so much attention to British football, which Africans seem to love. So, you know, it's a complicated story. However, we always just have to position, I think, what is most relevant to Africa. And you can't pick and choose and cover everything. So, you know, take what opportunities there are, collaborations there are, but always think, you know, what is an African agenda, or Eswatini agenda, or Basotho agenda, whatever the case is, that would really make this thing relevant to the society in which we live and the region in which we live. So that's my response to your first question. Response to the second question, yeah. Authoritarianism. You know, I once heard a very interesting piece of advice, and this was that even authoritarians need quality information, because authoritarians, if they only have propaganda, they cannot rely on their own intelligence services to tell them what's going on. And we have to make that case, and we have to say to authoritarians, yeah, you want to be in charge, but I'll tell you something, you have to have a modus vivendi with journalism. Because without journalism, as unhappy as it makes you feel, you're going to be in some kind of bubble that you don't really know what's going on. You have no idea of the sentiment. You've got no idea of the issues. You don't even know what those who are telling you what they're really doing. And somehow we have to make that case. Even if they're not going to change the authoritarianism, you have to make the case that modern societies, you cannot function without information and verified information in the public interest, even if that's sometimes against the interest of the authoritarians. Unless we can do that, I mean, the whole thing is just gone. And the other part of that today, this is an argument one could have made 10 years ago. Today, it's not just that governments could control media and that was the end of the story. They cannot control social media. And they cannot control especially social messaging, which is off the radar, like WhatsApp. So the argument that I make when I'm speaking to government, better the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Work with the media, give them space. I know you're unhappy with them. Sometimes your unhappiness is justified because sometimes the media doesn't do what it should be doing. But you know, at least you can deal with them. They're in the public space. And we have to make this case, because if you're just going to get into a war with authoritarians, the media doesn't have peace. The media doesn't have power like authoritarians have. The media's got to work on behalf of the public, but has to find a dialogue with the authorities. I don't easily see a way you can move ahead without that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Prof. Unfortunately, our time is very limited. We could go on and on, But I would just like to get your last word to the journalists, Prof, who are here from Southern Africa, perhaps in just about 2 minutes or less.
Well, a lot of the people here, of course, are scholars at the moment, and thanks, of course, to CanonCollins Trust. And you're a former journalist, most of you also. Maybe you'll go back to journalism, maybe you'll become journalism teachers, maybe you'll work in an NGO, maybe you'll do journalism in an NGO, whatever. Please, your scholarship, make it relevant, make it known. Do your best, please, to take those findings and discuss them with whoever, with the media, with authorities, with NGOs, with donors. Don't let that knowledge just sit in your head and in some obscure thesis, which is put on a shelf somewhere. Please use that knowledge. Share it. That's my closing message.
Professor Guy Berger, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. We've had an afternoon, at least for us here in Southern Africa, it is an afternoon. It's been great having with you, and we are happy that you took your time to have this conversation with us.
All the best to you and to everybody else. And I'll be back in Southern Africa next year, and because I take retirement from UNESCO, and it'll be nice to be home.